Thank you for joining me. As usual, a fully illustrated PDF of this presentation is available by following the YouTube link. As you can see, the presentation is entitled The Life of Elizabeth de Vere, daughter of Shakespeare, wife of Shakespeare, or neither. Now the title may seem a little odd. Indeed, it's quite a strange story, as you're about to find out. You are looking at a painting from the late 16th century of Elizabeth de Vere. She was the eldest daughter of Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, who wrote under the pen name William Shakespeare. When she was born, Edward de Vere refused to recognise her as his own, and as a result was estranged from his wife Anne for 6 years. Later in life, Elizabeth married William Stanley, the 6th Earl of Derby, who is thought by some to have written the works of Shakespeare. In these two presentations, we're going to explore her life, looking in particular at those two aspects. I'll also show you a painting which for many years has been hanging in Montacute House in Somerset. Part 1 concerns the parentage of Elizabeth de Vere, and to understand this, we need to look carefully at the character of Edward de Vere and the circumstances surrounding her birth. I will present you with the recorded facts, which, as you will find out, raise some interesting questions, each of which I'll address to try and make sense of it all. I've employed several notable sources which record both transcriptions of original records and letters, together with the author's own personal interpretations of them. The first is the Cecil Papers held at Hatfield House, which record all the correspondence of William Cecil, later Lord Burleigh. The second is records of the Elizabethan court day by day. This is not, as you may imagine, a true diary of events. It's a reconstruction of court life made by Marion Colthorpe, who died in 2021. She spent 43 years working on original records and contemporary publications from England and overseas, and her work is available online at Folgerpedia. The third source is Mark Anderson's biography of Edward de Vere, Shakespeare by Another Name, The Life of Edward de Vere, Earl of Oxford, the Man Who Was Shakespeare. It was published in 2005. The fourth source is Charlton Ogburn's book, The Mysterious William Shakespeare, The Myth and the Reality. Ogburn came from a family dedicated to promoting Edward de Vere as William Shakespeare, his parents having published a massive work entitled This Star of England in 1200 pages, and that was published in 1953. His effort was a slightly less weighty tome at 900 pages, published in 1984. The fifth source is Alan Nelson's book, Monstrous Adversary, The Life of Edward de Vere, and it was published in 2003. It is essentially a character assassination by a dedicated Stratfordian, and doggedly recounts in great detail the recorded facts of de Vere's chaotic life, the argument being that how could such a dreadful man like that have written Shakespeare's works? From the standpoint of an Oxfordian, it's very easy to overlook the fact that Edward de Vere was by any standards not a very nice man. He was narcissistic, entitled, pugilistic, and in my opinion on the autistic spectrum. To top it all, he was hopeless with money and a soft touch for any struggling poet or playwright. While it's easy to criticise Nelson's book, he did a great service by uncovering much new documentation of the period. My last source is that of Nina Green, the Canadian Shakespearean scholar, whose website, the Oxford Authorship site, is both extensive and detailed, including a biography of Edward de Vere. Fortunately for me, the time frame of interest to us covers only a small part of these works, for which I'm very glad. In order to put things into perspective, we need to go back to the childhood of Edward de Vere and to follow him up to his departure on his continental journey in 1575. Note that through the story I have chosen to refer to Edward de Vere by his first name, except when quoting from contemporary documents. Edward was born on the 12th of April 1550 at Hedingham Castle in Essex. He was educated from an early age by private tutors, and in November of 1558 he joined Queen's College, Cambridge. But there are no further college records after March of 1559. From this time he appears to have lived at the house of his tutor, Sir Thomas Smith. Edward's father, John, the 16th Earl, died unexpectedly on the 3rd of August 1562, and his mother, Marjorie Golding, 6 years later, on the 2nd of December 1568. Following John's death, Edward became a ward of court. This was an iniquitous system set up by Henry VIII, essentially to rob wealthy orphans of the landed gentry. There's more than a hint that the passage of the fathers from this world was eased by some other unscrupulous nobleman. Under usual circumstances, estates were distributed by William Cecil, the Queen's chief adviser, to whichever of his cronies was prepared to bid the highest. The estates were then managed until the young courtier reached the age of maturity, when they were returned on receipt of a substantial payment and a share of the ongoing income. On the upside, the young charges were given the finest education possible, living in Cecil House on the Strand, together with Cecil's family. The system lay at the heart of later rebellion. The eminent historian Lawrence Stone noted among the young nobility a personal recklessness of behaviour whose main cause was psychological rather than social. A whole generation of spirited young aristocrats grew up in open rebellion against the conservative establishment in general, and William Cecil, later Lord Burleigh in particular. Their only revenge was to adopt a life of absurdly prodigal extravagance, perplexing the great lord. Court of Ward's documents record Edward's arrival to begin his residency at Cecil House. The 3rd day of September came riding out of Essex from the funeral of the Earl of Oxford, his father, the young Earl of Oxford, with 70 horse, all in black, through London and Cheap and Ludgate, and so to Temple Bar, between 5 and 6 of the clock at afternoon. If you think a bit more deeply about this, here's a 12-year-old riding from Hedingham to London, a distance of some 60 miles, accompanied by 140 horsemen. Edward would have entered London either by Bishopsgate or Aldgate. He then went along Cheapside, which was a market area, and past St. Paul's Church. This was the main route between the Tower of London and Westminster. Next, he rode underneath Ludgate. He then went along Fleet Street to Temple Bar, the symbolic demarcation of the City of London and Westminster. It was a wooden structure at this stage and looked something like this. The last part of the journey was along the Strand to his destination, Cecil House. In fact, William Cecil had got his hands on it in 1559, with a view to developing not only this building, but others owned by the nobility along the Strand. His position in charge of the Court of Wards presented a ready supply of cash. The Agas map shows it around the time of purchase as a rather modest dwelling, with the great houses running down to the Thames on the south side of the Strand. Work commenced immediately, and by 1564 he'd acquired land from the adjoining convent garden and built a substantial property. The work continued for 10 years, such that during the time that Edward and Anne Cecil lived there, it was a building site. I'm going to digress slightly here to show you more about how the house developed over time, not strictly relevant, but a fine tale. The next glimpse of the house is in 1593, in this much copied map by John Norden. This greatly enlarged view shows the main house with some similarities to the original building, but now surmounted by 4 spires, and a garden with 3 banqueting houses and 2 fountains, and at the back a gate into what was still referred to as Convent Garden. By the 1580s, Lord Burleigh considered the house to be outdated, but convenient as a London base. By that stage he was heavily engaged on the building of Theobald's, of which more later. This engraving from the early 17th century by Richard Sawyer shows the 4 towers of Burleigh House rising above Savoy House, which is in the foreground. And this remarkable drawing by Wenceslas Holler from around 1660 shows the house now renamed as Exeter House after Lord Burleigh's oldest son Thomas, who was then the first Earl of Exeter. Sadly, Exeter House was demolished in 1676 to be replaced by the Exeter Exchange, still on the same footprint jutting into the Strand. It had shops on the ground floor and in later years a menagerie on the upper floors, which became infamous for the shooting by soldiers of its grumpy elephant, Tewny, shown here in the background. It took 152 musket balls, a harpoon and a sword to finish the job. The ignominy didn't end there. The animal was butchered and dissected in front of a paying audience at the Royal College of Surgeons, and the skeleton displayed there, including bullet holes, only to be finally obliterated in the Blitz of the Second World War. This Exeter Exchange itself was eventually demolished to be replaced by the current Palace Hotel, somehow much more to Lord Burleigh's liking. Now to return to our story. On the 1st of February 1567, Edward, aged 17, was admitted to Gray's Inn, one of the 3 inns of court, which stood on Gray's Inn Lane. As the woodcut by Agas shows, this was nowhere near the impressive building we see today. The hall, however, was present at this time, being completed in 1559. Edward probably continued to live at Cecil House, as it was here in the backyard on the 23rd of July 1567 that he accidentally killed a yeoman while practising fencing. The official investigation blamed the yeoman for running onto his sword. By this age, Edward was a young courtier and dressed as such. The extent of his spending on his apparel and weapons alone exceeded his cash inheritance. The Court of Ward's documents record that by 1570 he was claiming expenses for servants and apothecaries, indicating that he was living independently as well as suffering from ill health. It's now time to meet his future wife, Anne Cecil. She was born on the 5th of December 1556, the first surviving daughter of Sir William Cecil and Mildred Cook. She was more than 6 years Edward's junior. Mildred was one of the 5 illustrious Cook sisters, educated by her father Sir Anthony to the same level as her brothers. She spoke Greek as easily as English and was considered to rank alongside Lady Jane Grey for erudition. It was Mildred who was responsible for the education of the wards alongside her natural children. William Cecil provided a world-class library and access to the finest minds in England. It would be fair to say that this was a serious and fiercely academic household, and that daughter Anne would have been highly intelligent and well educated, although with little experience of the world outside her house. William Cecil was an ambitious man, and a marriage to a wealthy titled family would have been a great prize. His first attempt in 1569 was to marry Anne Cecil, aged 13, to Philip Sidney, then aged 15. He was to become the most famous soldier poet of his day. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, was Sidney's uncle, and without an heir his fortune would have descended to him. Negotiations stalled as Cecil and Leicester shared a common dislike, and there was financial deadlock. As it happened, Philip Sidney was disinherited by the birth of Robert Dudley's son, so the arrangements terminated. In February 1571, Cecil was ennobled, thereafter being named Lord Burleigh, and in summer of the same year he accepted on his daughter's behalf a marriage proposal from the Earl of Oxford. By this stage, Edward had to some extent escaped from Burleigh's burdensome control, but was still financially deeply indebted both to him and the Queen. His decision to marry Anne was to bring him eventually to financial ruin. The first intimation we get is in a letter dated the 28th of July, written to the Earl of Rutland, who was a year older than Edward, fellow ward of court, and knew both parties well. The Earl of Oxford hath gotten him a wife, or at the least a wife hath caught him. This is Mistress Anne Cecil, whereunto the Queen hath given her consent, and the which hath caused great weeping, wailing, and sorrowful cheer of those that had hoped to have that golden day. You might think that this had all been engineered by Lord Burleigh, but apparently this is not so. Here is an extract from a letter dated the 15th of August from him to Lord Rutland. I think it doth seem strange to your lordship to hear of a purposed determination in my Lord of Oxford to marry with my daughter. I could not well imagine what to think, considering I never meant to seek it, nor hoped of it. Now that the matter is determined betwixt my Lord of Oxford and me, I confess to your lordship I do honour him so dearly from my heart as I do my own son. And surely, my lord, by dealing with him, I find there is much more in him of understanding than any stranger to him would think. And for my own part, I find that whereof I take comfort in his wit and knowledge, grown by good observation. There's just a hint here of Lord Burleigh over-egging Edward's virtues, but a marriage to the Queen's most senior courtier, what's not to like? Anne was not yet 15, but by all accounts was a nubile beauty, and Edward was the most eligible bachelor in England by way of his rank. Lord Burleigh was concerned about the risks of childbirth, and so the wedding was postponed until after Anne's birthday, on the 5th of December. The wedding took place on the 16th of December in Westminster Abbey, with the Queen in attendance. It was indeed a double wedding, in that Edward Somerset married Elizabeth Hastings, who curiously had been Edward's optional intended, arranged by his father before he died. Much thought has been given to why Edward, at the age of just 21, would have wanted to permanently shackle himself to Lord Burleigh, who was in the process of milking his finances. He could have had his pick of any of the eligible maids of honour, most older and more experienced than Anne. The consensus seems to be that he was better off with the devil he knew. Having Burleigh as a father-in-law kept him close to the Queen, and could easily be used to mobilise additional funds. After the occasion, Lord Burleigh wrote to Francis Walsingham, "I have been not unoccupied with feasting my friends at the marriage of my daughter, who is this day married to the Earl of Oxford, to my comfort by reason of the Queen's Majesty, who hath very honourably with her presence and great favour accompanied it." Edward and Anne rented an apartment at the Savoy, a religious house on the Strand directly opposite Cecil House. Anne was not exactly straying too far from home. In 1572, following the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of Protestants in France, Edward lobbied Lord Burleigh to be able to set forth to sea, to which service I bear most affection. If there be no such intention, I shall be most willing to be employed on the sea coasts, to be in readiness against any invasion. Met with a rebuff, the couple moved to Edward's Essex estate at Wivenhoe on the River Colne, close to Colchester, which had recently been restored to his care. Wivenhoe Hall commanded an eminence on the River Colne estuary, and was a large and sumptuous house, with a noble gatehouse and towers of great height that served as a sea mark. Lord Burleigh described Edward as living during his Wivenhoe days like a wild man on a spending spree. Hundreds of pounds were flowing out of his accounts. One of his riotous servants, Roland York, was reportedly barring Anne from Edward's chamber, presumably at his command. Mark Anderson tells us that during the 1570s, York was to de Vere what Leicester was to the Queen, a man given practically carte blanche by his commanding authority to exercise his will, his whim, and his underhand tricks. Edward wrote to Lord Burleigh in October of 1572, denying any reckless or destructive behaviour, blaming what he called back friends of spreading malicious rumours about him. I found this document entitled Notes of an Ill-Used Wife misfiled in Cecil Papers of 1597. In fact, it refers to Anne de Vere in 1572. The notes were made during the Queen's progress of that year. They give an interesting insight into the circumstances Anne found herself in, and the presence of these in her father's papers indicated that she had given them to him. At Greenwich, no board wages for 2 grooms, usher, page, chamber keeper. Afterwards the cooks not paid. Horses lent to Smith before the progress. New nags for £13 sent to Theobald's. Unshod, no money to defray. Knocked up at 1 o'clock, waked. Kept out of his chamber at dinner and supper by York and others within. When Montmorency came, no money to buy before he was landed. This refers to the arrival of Duke Montmorency, who came with a marriage proposal for the Queen. Presumably it refers to lack of provisions. Not speak a word nor countenance in father's house. Presumably refers to Edward not speaking or giving her any support or approval. So many hundreds of pounds spent of the 10,000 come to his hand since marriage. Never one token of love in gown, button, aigrettes. An aigrette is a headdress with an egret's feather. A hose garter asked again. Presumably the request had been refused beforehand. No pillion to come from Wivenhoe, but a poor golden fustane. There was no proper pillion saddle, just one of rough cloth. His man to demand a note of her small plate in her own hand given her, and he never speak himself. Edward, through York, demanded a note of her gold and silver plate, i.e. her tangible wealth, which was often carried with the person, the implication being that her husband was eyeing it up for sale. Linen spoiled, very fine and damask. Lack of respect for her belongings, culprit unnamed. Women ill-gotten with child, men entertaining them in chamber and not dare find fault because they were great about him. Anne was not allowed to complain about Edward's associates. These jottings are hardly snapshots of a loving marriage. There is little recorded of Anne de Vere over the next 2 years. Edward, on the other hand, was busy on a literary front, translating and publishing, and of course flirting with the Queen. On the 11th of May 1573, a young courtier named Gilbert Talbot wrote to his father, George Talbot, 6th Earl of Shrewsbury, "My Lord of Oxford is lately grown into great credit, for the Queen's Majesty delighteth more in his personage and his dancing and valiance than any other. If it were not for his fickle head, he would pass any of them shortly. My Lady Burleigh unwisely has declared herself as it were jealous, which has come to the Queen's ear, whereat she's been not a little offended with her, but now she is reconciled again." At all of these love matters my Lord Treasurer, Lord Burleigh, winketh, and will not meddle in any way. Edward had entered into rivalry with Sir Christopher Hatton, captain of the bodyguard, for the Queen's affections. There's good documentary evidence that the Queen and Hatton were intimate, and I've discussed elsewhere the possible outcome of Edward's relationship with the Queen. Charlton Ogburn describes the occasions on which Edward and the Queen were alone together in her various progresses, and the pointers from his poetry that this was a deep relationship, one in which they became lovers. Ever one to scandalise her cousin, Mary Queen of Scots wrote in a letter to the Queen that she'd heard that Edward de Vere had not had sex with his wife, for fear of losing favour which he hoped to receive by becoming your lover. On June the 28th, Edward approached the Queen with some unknown suit, which probably involved funding for an overseas trip. His suit was rejected on the grounds of unthriftiness. 2 days later, at a time of great suspicion between England and Spain, Edward set sail for France and travelled to Flanders against the Queen's express wishes. Mark Anderson believes that the journey was to collect £15,000, equivalent to the dowry for his marriage to Anne, Lord Burleigh having arranged a murky payoff deal. Others believed that Edward, who departed with a great deal of money, had planned a visit to Italy, and others still that he was about to join Catholic exiles in Flanders. The upshot of Edward's trip was royal wrath. He returned to England on the 28th of July 1574 and was met by Lord Burleigh and Anne, with whom he travelled to Theobald's, where he spent the time hunting deer, waiting for the Queen's verdict. Unfortunately, I can find no portrait of Anne de Vere, so this lady has kindly agreed to stand in for her. She was painted by an unknown artist in around 1570, and she currently hangs in Montacute House in Somerset. She wears exquisite clothing and jewellery, indicating that she was of very high status. It is thought to be a marriage portrait, so maybe she is Anne. On the 13th of September 1574, Anne wrote from Theobald's a letter to the officer in charge of the Queen's household, Sir Thomas Radcliffe, the Earl of Sussex, asking if he could reserve another room at Hampton Court where the Queen would be lodging in October. She hoped she could persuade her husband to resume sleeping with her. The more commodious my lodging, the willinger I hope my lord, my husband, will be to come hither, thereby the oftener to attend her majesty. Edward had regained the Queen's favour, but disappeared from the court records for the rest of the summer progress. He appeared at a garden party at Theobald's between the 16th and 20th of September, the dates differing in the accounts. Anne was present as well. This is a reconstruction by Emily Cole of Cambridge University showing Theobald's Palace in Cheshunt, Hertfordshire, owned by Lord Burleigh and of its time the most luxurious private dwelling in the country. Indeed, years later it was appropriated by James I. It was built around 2 courtyards. Alan Nelson tells us that Lord Burleigh yearned for Oxford to command Anne to join him anywhere at all, for they'd been married for 2.5 years with no sign of a pregnancy. He goes on to say that Oxford had been sexually active with other partners during this time, but gives no reference to support this. It's possible to define the internal architecture, and here is the first floor, showing quite clearly that Edward and Anne had lodgings for their use within the building. Whether or not they slept together is not known. The Queen arrived at Hampton Court on October the 1st and remained until November the 20th. Lord Burleigh, in his chronology, records October at Hampton Court. There's no specific mention of Anne and Edward. Other authors make the assumption that the pair were at Hampton Court for the duration of the month. The court records, however, for the whole of October contain no reference to them. B.M. Ward, another biographer, tells us that the Earl found little in Anne to hold his interest and felt out of place at court, He preferred his new country muses and his lewd friends, as Lord Burleigh called them. For the next few references, I've grouped them by relevance to the story, so they're not strictly in chronological order, as some refer back to previous events. As a consequence of later events, Lord Burleigh wrote out the relevant dates on a sheet of paper. The final entry reads: "The Countess fell sick at Hampton Court afore November, i.e. at the end of October. She had persistent vomiting, unable to keep anything down. Such an illness would of course fit very well for severe vomiting of early pregnancy. On the 7th of November, Sir Thomas Smith sent Lady Burleigh medicinal water, along with a letter from Hampton Court, in which he describes fennel and angelica water for her nausea, and expresses fears lest my Lady of Oxford should miscarry. Anne then spent November and December largely in the company of her mother." By January of 1575, the Queen had agreed to allow Edward to journey overseas, at least in part as her representative at the coronation of Henri III. He was still in London on the 30th of January, but by the 7th of February Edward had left the country. In a memo from later in 1576, Lord Burleigh wrote that before departure she, Anne, made him, Edward, privy that she thought she was with child, whereof he said he was glad. When he was certified thereof at Paris, he sent her his picture with kind letters and messages. He sent her 2 coach horses. So the evidence seems strong that Anne was pregnant from the time she was with Edward at Hampton Court, and that she was aware of this, and so was Edward. In a letter to Lord Burleigh, Dr. Richard Masters, the Queen's physician, played here by an actor, describes an unsuccessful attempt by Anne, only a week after Edward's departure, to persuade him to perform an abortion on her. He discussed the matter with the Queen and made reference to this. "My Lady of Oxford, being here at Shrovetide, had dealt with me to prepare some medicines as menses proportiones, in other words, to cause the menses to resume, but I counselled her to stay a while. Her Majesty asked me how the young lady did bear the matter. I answered that she kept it secret for 4 or 5 days from all persons, and that her face was much fallen and thin with little colour. When she was comforted and counsels to be gladsome and so rejoice, she would cry, Alas, alas, how should I rejoice, seeing that he that should rejoice with me is not here, and to say truth, I stand in doubt whether he pass judgment upon me and the pregnancy or not, and bemoaning her case would lament that after so long a sickness of body she should enter a new grief and sorrow of mind." Now the last part of the sentence may be helpful. Anne describes a long sickness of body, implying that it had by that stage passed. Usually vomiting in pregnancy resolves between 16 and 20 weeks, although in a small percentage of women it may persist. The consultation took place about 20 weeks, so this would fit nicely. Anne then describes a new grief and sorrow of mind. In this context, I read this as grief meaning hardship, and sorrow of mind meaning sadness. The letter goes on. At this her Majesty showed great compassion, as your lordship shall hear hereafter, and repeated my Lord of Oxford's answer to me, which he'd made openly in the presence chamber of her Majesty, that being, that if she were with child it was not his. I answered that it was the common answer of lusty courtiers everywhere, so to say. Then she asked, and being answered of me, who was in the next chamber, she called my Lord of Leicester, and telleth him all. And here an end was made, and severally the Queen showed herself unfeignedly to rejoice, and in great offence with my Lord of Oxford, repeating the same to my Lord Leicester after he came to her. Thus much rather to show my good will than otherwise desiring your lordship, that there may be a note to be taken of the first day of quickening, for thereof somewhat may be known noteworthy. From Richmond, the 7th of March, 1575, by your lordship's most bounden, Richard Masters. As you can see, this letter was dated 3 weeks after the event, following an audience between Dr. Masters and the Queen, during which he informed her of the pregnancy. Anne would have been 5 months pregnant at this stage, if she'd conceived at Hampton Court. Dr. Masters' final comment is interesting, as he is implying that the date of conception could be estimated from the first day of quickening. So did he have some doubts? In May of 1576, nearly 12 months after the birth, Lord Burleigh wrote to Dr. William Aubrey, who'd served as Anne's obstetrician. He was making an appeal for more information, as Dr. Master had recommended that there may be a note from the day of first quickening. Aubrey's entirely non-committal reply of the 27th of May 1576 suggests that he'd been threatened into silence. In the first paragraph, he declares that Burleigh must understand that he is prohibited from testifying on Anne's behalf, and that he can do nothing about the prohibition because it has come from others. Aubrey asked Burleigh to guess the circumstances. In the second paragraph, Aubrey declares that it's first duty to save his own life. Next after that, he places his duty to Burleigh and Burleigh's dependents, including Anne, an interesting interpretation of the Hippocratic Oath. In the third paragraph, he informs Burleigh that he's been commanded to use secrecy, and he asks Burleigh either to tear up the letter or to send it back with the seal restored, or otherwise dispose of it. Burleigh merely filed it away in his papers, which is why it has survived. On March the 17th, 1575, Edward, while still in Paris, received news or confirmation of Anne's pregnancy. He wrote thus, expressing his pleasure: "My lord, your letters have made me a glad man, for these last have put me in assurance of that good fortune which your former mentioned doubtfully. I thank God, therefore, with your lordship, that it hath pleased him to make me a father, where your lordship is a grandfather. And if it be a boy, I shall likewise be the partaker with you in a greater contentation. But thereby to take an occasion to return, I'm far off that opinion. For now it hath pleased God to give me a son of mine own, and I hope it is, methinks I have the better occasion to travel sith, whatsoever becometh me, I leave behind me one to supply my duty and service, either to my prince or else my country." The interesting part of this is that he does not deny paternity. Indeed, he uses it to justify continuing his journey. The records show that Anne gave birth to her daughter on the 2nd of July, 1575. On the following day, Sir Walter Mildmay, statesman and friend of Lord Burleigh, wrote with his congratulations: "I thank God heartily with your lordship for the good delivery it hath pleased him to give my Lady Oxford. I trust God shall make her a glad mother of many children." Edward's name was not mentioned. In the day-to-day diary of the Elizabethan court is the description of the baptism of Elizabeth de Vere at Theobald's on July the 10th, 1575, with the Queen as godmother. 4 days later, a baptismal gift of a basin, a piece of plate, and a standing cup were received as a gift from the Queen. So what does all this tell us? With the birth on July the 2nd, 1575, if we use the pregnancy calculator, the date of conception would have been around 38 weeks earlier, around the 9th of October. Lord Burleigh records that both Edward and Anne were at Hampton Court for at least part of this month. This would seem to fit perfectly with dates corroborated by the letter and the court record. However, it seemed to me that being seriously ill only 3 weeks from conception was very short. Here is a graph from a 2021 study of 214 women by Roger Gadsby, showing that the time from ovulation, as defined by hormonal changes, to the onset of vomiting can be very short indeed, only 8 days. In fact, 67% of women experience symptoms within 11 to 20 days of ovulation. So once again, this is consistent with conception at Hampton Court. Edward remained abroad for 14 months, chiefly in Italy, and during this time he spent in the region of £1 million by today's money. He returned to Venice in September of 1575 to find that 3 packets of letters he'd sent to his wife and father-in-law had been returned because the letter carriers were denied passage across the Alps because of plague. The timing of this is significant, and I'll explain shortly. He did, however, receive a letter from Lord Burleigh in late September informing him of the birth of Elizabeth. I can find no record of the letter or the date of it being written. Edward replied in a very long letter in which he discusses the post, the plague, his sickness, his travel, his finances and his lands. My good Lord, I've been grieved with a fever, yet with the help of God now I have recovered the same and am past the danger thereof, though brought very weak thereby and hindered from a great deal of travel, which grieves me most, fearing time not sufficient for my desire. Your Lordship seems desirous to know how I like Italy, what is my intention to travel, and when I mean to return. For my liking of Italy, my Lord, I'm glad I've seen it, and care not ever to see it any more, unless it be to serve my prince or country. And on it went. Then right at the end comes this. Thus thanking your Lordship for your good news of my wife's delivery, I recommend myself unto your favour. Hardly an expression of joy at becoming a father for the first time, and I suspect it would have been very different had it been a boy. It was, however, of great importance to Lord Burleigh as a confirmation of Edward's paternity. He recorded it in a later memorandum. The letter of the Earl by which he gives thanks for his wife's delivery, mark well this letter. Edward was in no rush to return home from Italy. On the 27th of November he was in Padua, and short of cash. He wrote a brief letter to Lord Burleigh. I shall desire your Lordship to make no stay of the sales of my land. Very concise and to the point. Please send more money. On the 3rd of January 1576, Edward wrote a letter from Siena under pressure from his creditors. Lord Burleigh wisely advised against sale of properties, as these were the source of his income, and Edward rails against this, explaining this is his only option for him to maintain his standing as a foreign courtier. He declares, I have none other remedy. I have no help but of mine own, and mine own is made to serve me and myself, not mine. Mine here is referring to his properties. In other words, my monies and lands serve me and not the other way round. As Mark Anderson points out, he had a point, as during his life his estates had mostly been serving others, i.e. the Queen and Robert Dudley. On March the 5th, 1576, Edward left Venice for home, arriving at Paris by way of Lyon. All of the commentators report that he returned to Paris in good spirits, but this all changed on April the 4th, and he left promptly for England. On arrival, according to notes made by Lord Burleigh, a change had come over Edward. No unkindness known on his part at his departure. When he heard she was delivered, he gave me thanks by his letters for advising thereof. He never signified any misliking of anything until the 4th of April in Paris, from whence he wrote somewhat that, by reason of a man of his receiver, he had received some unkindness. But he prayed me let it pass the same, for it did grow by the doubleness of his servants. In other words, his servants may have been exaggerating. The receiver was Rowland Yorke, who had been accompanying the Earl during the past several months, and of whom more later. Lord Burleigh wrote to Edward to hasten home, which he duly did, and during passage his ship was set upon by Dutch pirates, and he was lucky to escape with his life. Edward was met at Gravesend by Lord Burleigh's son Thomas and Lord Henry Howard. Anne had been specifically advised not to meet him until she knew how the land lay. Lord Burleigh emphasised, "All this while I knew of no misliking towards me or his wife." Rumours about the unknown father of Elizabeth de Vere had spread beyond the Queen's present chamber and the Lord Treasurer's privy chamber. Anderson opines that Burleigh was managing the crisis with a shotgun approach. He'd fetched his son Thomas from 100 miles away to greet Edward at Dover and learn the Earl's mind. He'd also sent Lord Henry Howard, Norfolk's brother and Edward's cousin, to bear Burleigh and Anne's greetings to him. Other messengers followed soon after. Anne and Edward's sister Mary took a coach to Gravesend to intercept him on his way to London, or at least intercept any messengers bearing further news about the Earl's arrival. Meanwhile, none of these busybodies seemed to appreciate the fact that the stripped and humiliated man narrowly escaped death. Easter weekend was upon them, and Lord Burleigh suggested via messenger that Edward take his lodgings at Cecil House. However, Edward undoubtedly knew that once he entered Burleigh's managed care, access to information about the previous 17 months would be closely screened. On the 23rd of April, Lord Burleigh wrote a tortuous and obsequious letter to the Queen, proclaiming the innocence of any wrongdoing on either his or his daughter's behalf. It gave the distinct impression of protesting too much. I sent letters to entreat him to take my house for his lodging, whereof I had no answer, and yet I wrote twice by 2 several messengers. But my son sent me word that he found himself disposed to keep himself secretly 2 or 3 days in his own lodging. He did suddenly leave a barge and took a wherry, and only the Roland York landed near York's house. In fact, it was York's brother's house on Walbrook near London Stone. And the messenger did come from his wife with request that if he should not come that night to her father's house, she would come to him, for she desired to be one of the first that might see him. To it he answered neither yea nor nay, but said, "Why, I've answered you," meaning that he would keep himself secret for 2 or 3 days as the messenger took it. On the 27th of April, Edward replied in a rage to Lord Burleigh, whose words raised open suspicion of his daughter and made her disgraced to the world. Urged by your letters to satisfy you the sooner, I must let your lordship understand thus much. That is, until I can better satisfy or advertise myself of some mislikes, I am not determined as touching my wife to accompany her. What they are, because some are not to be spoken of or written upon as imperfections. Some that otherwise discontent me I will not blaze or publish until it please me. And last of all, I mean not to weary my life any more with such troubles and molestations as I've endured, nor will I, to please your lordship only, discontent myself. Considering the respect shown in previous correspondence, this is a pretty aggressive missive by a very angry man. He went on to say, this might have been done through private conference before, and had not needed to have been the fable of the world, if you would have had the patience to have understood me. But I do not know by what or whose advice it was to run that course so contrary to my will or meaning, which made her disgraced. The world raised suspicions openly, that with private conference might have been more silently handled, and hath given me more greater cause to mislike. The letter, however, gives no clue as to what Anne was suspected of. However, his case against his parents-in-law is put explicitly in his next letter to Lord Burleigh. Edward alleged that his father-in-law did not provide him with sufficient money, ill-treated his followers, purposely aroused the Queen's indignation against him, while Lady Burleigh is accused of having declared she wished him dead, of undermining his wife's affection for him, and of slandering him. On the 12th of June 1575, Lord Burleigh wrote a memorandum concerning his daughter, headed "To be remembered." It ended thus: "I desire that his lordship will yield to her, being his wife, either that love that a loving and honest wife ought to have, or otherwise to be so used as all lewd and vain speeches may cease of his unkindness to her, and that with his favour and permission she may both come to his presence and be allowed to do her duty to her Majesty, if her Majesty therewith be content, and she shall bear, as she may, the lack of the rest. Or else his lordship will notify some instant cause of her not deserving such favour, and that she may be permitted to make her answer thereto before such as her Majesty may please to appoint." Undoubtedly, beginning at the latest by Roland York in Paris, third parties had been working to poison relations between Oxford and the family into which he'd married. On July the 12th the two men met, and the next day Edward penned a letter. "My very good lord, yesterday, at your lordship's earnest request, I had some conference with you about your daughter. I did agree that you could bring her to the court, with condition that she should not come when I was present, nor at any time have speech with me, and further that your lordship shall not urge further in her cause. But now I understand that your lordship means this day to bring her to the court, and that you mean afterwards to prosecute the cause with further hope. Now if your lordship shall do so, then shall you take more in hand than I have or can promise you, for always I have and I will still prefer mine own content before that of others. I shall desire your lordship not to take advantage of my promise till you have given me your honourable assurance by letter or word of your performance of the condition. Otherwise, all that is done can stand to no effect. From my lodging at Charing Cross this morning, your lordship's to employ Edward Oxford." Both parties had handled the situation badly. Lord Burleigh had insisted on an immediate public acknowledgement of Anne's virtue and Elizabeth de Vere's paternity. Edward had refused to give it. Burleigh was ill and anxious about his daughter's position. Edward was worn out by travelling and unnerved by a close escape from death. Neither Burleigh nor Edward had ever got on with the other, appreciated the other's strength, or been able to abide the other's failings. This moment was the beginning of a decisive change in de Vere's life and fortunes. Edward turned over to his wife the house at Wivenhoe and their lodgings in the Savoy, but live with her he would not. According to Burleigh, he would make the sons of the young uncle his heirs male if he could. These were his cousins Francis and Horatio Vere, then aged 16 and 11 respectively. Edward was to be estranged from his wife for 6 years, during which time he had a disastrous affair with Anne Vavasour, which resulted in a son, later Sir Edward Vere, whom Edward had little to do with. So these are the facts as they've been recorded. They are, however, not gospel, and we should bear in mind, because truth may be twisted by those with an agenda. Both Lord Burleigh and his son Robert were widely believed to have censored and modified their records to show themselves in a favourable light. I found from my days as an expert witness in medical negligence the best way to assess complex, seemingly confusing stories is to pose a series of questions, the answers to which may bring some clarity. Remember, we're trying to answer the most basic one, and that is whether or not Elizabeth de Vere was the daughter of Edward by his wife Anne, and if she was, how on earth did it all go so wrong? Was this a conventional marriage? Far from it. The marriage took place on the 16th of December 1571. Anne was only 15 and Edward 21. She led a sheltered life, and he was an outgoing, independent and sexually experienced young courtier who lived in Cecil House on and off for 9 years. The principal reason for Edward requesting the marriage was to provide easy access to his estates, the equivalent, if you like, of marrying the bank manager's daughter. The experience of the ward of courts made him view his assets as a source of ready cash, rather than something to be cherished for the next generation. Edward spent much time at court flattering the Queen and engaging with his literary friends and hangers-on. His relationship with Anne was well down his priority list, as is evidenced by the fact that Anne did not become pregnant in the first 3 years of marriage. Her rather pitiful notes given to her father give us a glimpse of how Edward mistreated her. Did Anne become pregnant in early October of 1574? Well, the evidence that she did is very strong. In particular, the onset of vomiting, the opinion of Sir Thomas Smith, and the date of Elizabeth's baptism, which would have been difficult to falsify given Sir Walter Mildmay's letter and the Queen's gifts. On the 3rd of January 1576, nearly 2 years later, Lord Burleigh penned a memorandum while he was trying to understand what went on. He, Oxford, confessed to my Lord Henry Howard that he lay not with his wife but at Hampton Court. That should settle it, of course. Pregnant in October, gives birth in July. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. Lord Henry Howard was a very divisive figure who hated Lord Burleigh with a vengeance, and several years later was to make scurrilous accusations against Edward. The remainder of the quotation reads thus: "And that then the child could not be his, because the child was born in July, which was not the space of 12 months. There's no record of any original document from Lord Howard, and when exactly was the confession made? Obviously not before Edward left for Europe, and during his absence Lord Howard did not leave England. It can only have been 18 months later, on his return. Then there is the issue of the 12 months. Surely Lord Burleigh and Edward knew how long a pregnancy was. All I can conclude is that this piece of evidence, either by error or design, is not reliable. It is, after all, based on a second-hand verbal comment by an unreliable witness, and part of it does not make sense. Why did Edward deny in open court paternity of any pregnancy while he was away? Once again, more intrigue. In Dr. Master's letter to Lord Burleigh, written a week after Edward's departure, he quotes Edward as saying in the presence of the Queen that if she, Anne, were with child, it was not his. This is, of course, contrary to what Lord Burleigh wrote, and implies that Edward had no knowledge of a pregnancy before he left. Dr. Masters went on to say he told the Queen, "I answered that it was the common answer of lusty courtiers everywhere, so to say." We do not know the context of Edward's comment, but the most likely explanation is that Edward did know of a possible pregnancy, and the comment was either in jest or to avoid pressure to remain in England. Why was Anne so keen to abort the baby? The reason for seeing Dr. Masters was for Anne to be given some medicine to restore her menses, clearly a reference to aborting the baby. Dr. Masters counselled Anne to wait a few days, and then she would feel much better about it, at which she came distressed. My interpretation of this is that she was physically exhausted from weeks of vomiting, and was now facing the psychological strain of missing her husband and knowing his character, beginning to doubt his acceptance of her condition. She wanted a way out, hence the consultation, but Dr. Masters recognised it for what it was, a cry for help. When told the story, the Queen called in Robert Dudley, who was in the next room, and told him the whole story, and this may have some relevance, as I'll explain later. Dr. Masters then made a final comment, that there may be a note to be taken from the day of first quickening, for thereof something may be known noteworthy. What did he mean by this? Presumably it must reflect some doubt in his mind as to the timing of the pregnancy. Quickening is the sensation of the baby moving inside the uterus. Its onset in first-time mothers is around 18 to 20 weeks, which is exactly where Anne was at that stage. Dr. Masters must have asked Anne if she'd felt the baby and received a negative reply, so why suggest searching for a note of something that had not yet happened? The waters become even more muddy by Dr. William Aubrey, Anne's obstetrician, who was asked about quickening by Lord Burleigh as part of his investigation in May of 1576. In his evasive reply, he said he was under threat not to answer. He even asked Lord Burleigh to guess who it might be who'd threatened him. Why was Edward initially so pleased at the news of the pregnancy? Edward received confirmatory word of Anne's pregnancy on the 17th of March 1575, and he appears to have been delighted by the news, in particular the prospect of a son, giving him the perfect excuse to continue with his journey. Should any misfortune befall him, he had an heir. A cynic might say that Edward was prepared to park the question of paternity until he returned home. His main focus was his journey, and he simply turned the news into his favour to allow him to continue. Why then did Edward change his mind in Paris? Something Edward was told on his return journey in Paris caused him great anger, and led to his hasty return to England. All of the commentators report rumours swirling around Westminster about Elizabeth de Vere's paternity. These centred on the belief that the birth was in September rather than the 2nd of July. This in turn was based on the question of why Edward had been informed of the birth some 3 months after it had occurred. This led to speculation by later commentators that there was some underlying skullduggery by Lord Burleigh and others. The argument went that if Anne were not pregnant and Edward died on his travels, there would be no heir and Anne would lose her status, so someone got her pregnant. In fact, the explanation for the delay in informing Edward of the birth may have been more mundane. Letters to and from Venice had been delayed by 6 weeks because of the plague. Unfortunately, this cannot be corroborated, as the date of writing and posting the letter is unknown. We have learned that letters going in the other direction were returned to sender because of the delay. Who started the rumour and why? The answer to this must be speculation, but there are 3 people in the frame. Firstly, Roland Yorke, secondly, Robert Dudley, and thirdly, Lord Henry Howard. So what of Roland Yorke? He was a comrade in arms of George Gascoigne, the poet and soldier, and he'd been in Oxford's household back in 1574, accompanying him on his continental trip. William Camden wrote of him, "This Yorke was a Londoner, a man of loose and dissolute behaviour, and desperately audacious, famous in his time among the common hacksters and swaggerers, as being the first that, to the great admiration of many of his boldness, brought into England that bold and dangerous way of thrusting with a rapier in duelling, whereas the English till that time used to fight with long swords and shields, striking with the edge. It was not considered gentlemanly to strike below the girdle." Another intriguing angle is that Roland Yorke's brother Edward was servant to the Earl of Leicester at the time of the Troubles. Leicester's Commonwealth, a scurrilous document thought to have been penned by the libeller Charles Arundel and published in 1584, contained allegations against the Earl of Leicester, one of which read thus: "Leicester hath ever used to sow and nourish debate and contention between the great lords of England and their wives. The same he attempted between the Earl of Oxford and his lady, daughter of the Lord Treasurer of England, and all for an old grudge he bore to her father, the said Lord Treasurer." Recall that Edward Yorke's house is where de Vere and his dear and trusted servant first stayed upon returning from the continent. You may remember I said earlier that the Earl of Leicester was invited into the discussion of Anne's pregnancy in March of 1575. He was party to the fact that she was requesting an abortion and did not think her husband would believe her pregnancy, in addition to there being some doubt about the date of conception, as estimated by the time of quickening. So was it he who passed this on, leading the information being fed back to Edward by the way of Roland York? Was it he who lent on the Queen's obstetrician not to reveal the recorded date of quickening, as it was consistent with an October conception? I think it may well have been. Dudley hated Burghley. What better way to destroy his family than to bring shame on Anne? Henry Howard was the second son of the Earl of Surrey and was Oxford's first cousin, and was reputedly one of the most learned noblemen of his day. He was also a Catholic and a secret supporter of Mary, Queen of Scots, for which he was to spend many years in confinement. Lady Anne Bacon, mother of Francis, described him as pretending courtesy, worketh mischief perilously, a subtle serpent. Years later, even Edward de Vere affirmed that the Howards were the most treacherous race under heaven, and my Lord Howard the worst villain that lived. The Catholic Howard had a strong motive for turning his cousin against his wife, to drive a wedge of mutual recrimination between the Premier Earl of England and the powerful Lord Burghley, bulwark of English Protestantism, would have been a major coup. Remember that it was he who met Edward on return to England. Why did Lord Burghley go into overdrive on Edward's arrival in England? There's no doubt that Lord Burghley perceived Edward's return as a great crisis. He spent much time trying to reason with him and in writing memos and notes in an attempt to understand what had transpired. The rumours concerning Anne's fidelity brought great shame both onto her and the reputation of his whole family, and by this stage they were out of control. Edward's intransigence didn't help matters, as did his broad attack on the way in which Lord Burghley had dealt with his financial affairs, laying open for the court to see how much control the good Lord had over him. Why was the issue not resolved straight away? Basically because Edward didn't want to. Edward and Lord Burghley met to discuss their differences, but there was no overall solution. Edward agreed for Anne to attend court, but only when he was not there, and he made available various properties for her use. He refused to recognise Elizabeth as his daughter and to return to his wife. Several commentators summarise the situation very well. First, Hilda Amphlett, an Oxfordian scholar. She writes, in 1576, the break may have coincided with his dearest wishes, to be able to pursue his life according to his own tastes, to associate with the writers and actors for whom Burghley showed open scorn. His travels may have enfranchised his spirit, and he may have seen the chance to remove himself from Burghley's dominance. Charlton Ogden muses that it would have been a rare wife with the intellect and wit to keep Oxford interested, and yet with the unquestioning loyalty, compassion and sufferance to support a creative genius in the trials he inevitably imposed on himself and endure those he imposed on others, including herself. Gentle, sweet, submissive and limited Anne was not that wife. In addition, she seems to have remained primarily the daughter of her parents. Receive her into your house, he told Burghley. Mark Anderson muses that for such an autobiographical artist as the Earl of Oxford, extreme agony and disturbance in life ultimately provided profound inspiration. The story of his trip to Italy and his chaotic return would resonate through many of his works. Indeed, Edward de Vere would spend the rest of his life writing about the dramatic and traumatic events of his 26th year. I cannot end this analysis without mention of the infamous bed trick. Some of those trying to reconcile the inconsistencies in the story came up with the idea that Edward, in a drunken stupor, bedded a young lady who, beknown to him, was actually his wife. This would have involved a fair degree of subterfuge, and indeed judgment, that he would be drunk enough not to recognise his wife, but sober enough to have intercourse with her. If such a ruse had taken place, then the controlled environment of Hampton Court Palace in October of 1574 would have been an ideal setting. Interestingly, the bed trick device makes an appearance in All's Well That Ends Well and Measure for Measure, as well as in other Renaissance works. Marlis Dessens describes 44 plays of the Renaissance period in which it occurred, all of which appear after 1574. So it was very much in the people's minds, if only in the theatre rather than the bedchamber. What really happened? Given the inconsistencies and probable misinformation, it's hard to be sure. It all turns on how much weight you give them in an argument. This, for what it's worth, is, I think, what happened. Anne became pregnant in early October of 1574 at Hampton Court, and after a difficult pregnancy, she delivered Elizabeth on the 2nd of July, 1575. Edward was aware that Anne was probably pregnant, and denying paternity for such while he was abroad was said in jest. It's possible, although I think very unlikely, that Anne became pregnant as a result of the bed trick at Hampton Court. Edward was pleased to receive confirmation of the pregnancy, as it gave him an excuse to continue his travels. The consultation with Dr. Masters was a cry for help when Anne was at a low physical and mental ebb. She lost her confidence and became depressed. She regained her composure following the consultations. The delay in Edward being informed of Elizabeth's birth was due to the post being held up because of the plague in Europe. The date of Elizabeth's birth and baptism are in the official records and supported by the dates of the letter from Sir Walter Mildmay and the gifts from the Queen. These would be difficult to falsify. So what exactly were these rumours? Well, the plotters had three pieces of evidence to work with. Firstly, the information gleaned from Anne's consultation with Dr. Masters. Secondly, Edward denying paternity while he was away. And thirdly, the delay in Edward being informed of the birth. There was enough here to spin a tale of infidelity on Anne's behalf. Doubt about dates, doubt about paternity, and a late birth, perhaps in September, meaning a conception in late December or early January 1575, at a time when Edward was otherwise engaged in organising his trip. Anne could have been pregnant in October, but had a miscarriage, and then made pregnant by a person unknown to ensure that should Edward not return, there would appear to be an heir. I've even read a rumour that it was Lord Burleigh himself or one of his sons who'd done the deed to bring this about. Once released to the court and beyond, the rumour mill would have been very difficult to control, with events no doubt embellished in the telling. Indeed, Edward hints at this in his misgivings, the nature of which he did not elaborate. But they were sufficient to be labelled the fable of the world. Inconsistencies in the rumours did not come to light, and even Lord Burleigh appeared confused as to what had been going on. Unfortunately, Lord Burleigh's approach made things worse by not settling the matter quietly and confidentially, culminating in Edward slinging at him all his gripes about the way he'd been treated. Edward, for his part, even if not initially intended, appears to have used the matter as an excuse to indulge himself in his own world. Anne was that far down the priority list. Why did Edward reconcile with Anne after 6 years? To be honest, no one knows for sure. It may have been the fallout of the scandal of the pregnancy of Anne Vavasour that persuaded him to try to regain favour with the Queen by making peace with his wife. Correspondence between the couple began in December of 1581, soon after Edward's release from prison following the Vavasour affair, and they were finally reconciled in 1582. Thereafter they lived together and had a total of 5 children, of which 3, Elizabeth, Bridget and Susan, reached adulthood. Anne de Vere died of a fever on the 5th of June 1588 at Greenwich Palace. She was just 31 years old. Philip Gordy, landowner and observer of the Elizabethan court, wrote to his sweet brother, "Brother, I forgot to write to you of the death of a great lady. My Lady of Oxford died at the court and is interred at Westminster. There is a great funeral a preparing, and I need not to write to you of the heaviness and mourning of many of her best friends." Edward was considered unfit to care for his 3 daughters, and they went back under the care of their grandparents. Unfortunately, Elizabeth's grandmother, Mildred Cook, who was largely responsible for the children's education, died the following year, so the family was without a female head. A bereft Lord Burleigh set about erecting a memorial to them both. And here it is, all 24 feet of it, in St. Nicholas's Chapel, Westminster Abbey. It's divided into several sections. In the centre are the recumbent figures of Anne at the rear, with her mother Mildred in the foreground and slightly lower. Both are dressed in ermine, and Anne has a unicorn at her feet. On the top in the centre is Lord Burleigh himself, and on the left of Anne and her mother is Robert Cecil, his younger son. On the right are Anne's 3 daughters, Elizabeth, Bridget and Susan. There's a definite likeness to Elizabeth's portrait of around 1595, with the high forehead and prominent nose. Lord Burleigh was never one to employ just a few words if he could use 1,000. Indeed, this monument has 9 panels of text, all in Latin. In the end, of course, Elizabeth became the de facto daughter of Edward. Quite what effect the scandal had on her early years is hard to judge. She was to grow up to become a very forthright and influential person, but that's another story, which is the subject of part 2. I've really enjoyed researching this project. To be honest, I usually skip over the blocks of original text, but it has been fascinating to look more closely, and one can only marvel at the clever use of words. I was very concerned that trying to present a text-laden presentation would make it indigestible for you, and I've presented the text on the page so that you can read it again if you wish. Remember, of course, that it's all on the PDF. As always, thank you very much for joining me.